And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting off with today's sea ice analysis, Togiak, Bristol Bays virtually ice-free now, and melting out here in Kuskokwim Bay, and also thinning ice in and around Nunivak Island, as well as up along the Yukon Delta coast there, with the main ice field well north of St. Paul Island. And from there, looking at tonight's forecast, weak system bringing some rain with it, and also with the front here. Gusty southeast winds, maybe 30-35 miles an hour in advance of the front, moving into the Alaska Peninsula, but rain extending all the way back to Adak 2. And up to the north here, a band of light snow, mainly over the upper Yukon Valley in toward Tanana or so with the colder air, and gusty northeast winds, 30 to 40 miles an hour through the passes of the Western Brooks Range. Few skiffs of snow possible on the eastern Arctic coast. Dry for the southeast coast. A better chance of showers now for the southern Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound to about Kodiak Island with a weak trough there. And then for tomorrow, this front spreads rain into Kodiak Island, links up with the moisture here over south central Alaska for a chance of showers over the Kenai Peninsula, southern Cook Inlet to the western Alaska Range. Mostly cloudy, showers with that trough in the central interior, clearing out to the north, and then just cloudy with light winds for the Arctic coast. Partly to mostly sunny with some isolated showers here over the southern panhandle, possible there with high pressure making winds light. And out to the west, big storm coming in, bringing gale force winds to the western Aleutians tomorrow evening and overnight. But that'll weaken, the front will weaken as it pulls eastward here away from the main low center. So small craft advisory level winds with rain for Adak and Atka pushing into the eastern Aleutians late in the day. Chance of rain, south central Alaska. Rain likely for Kodiak Island. Otherwise, mostly cloudy, a lot of clouds over the southern interior, but mostly clear up here to the north. And a chance of snow for the central Arctic coast. Dry, mostly sunny for the southeast coast. Coastal water forecasts, variable winds at 10 knots for the inside waters, seas at about 2 feet. For the south coast here, winds predominantly out of the east at 10. Northeast at 10 knots for the central coast, and then variable at 10 for the north coast, with seas running 3 to 4 feet. Outlook for Thursday, east winds 10 to 15 knots for the north coast, south coast, east winds 10 to 15 knots. Light variable winds 5 to 10 knots for the inside waters. And for Prince William Sound, southeast winds 15 knots, and the eastern North Gulf Coast winds southeast 10 to 15 knots, southeast at 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. And for southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 15, light winds, northern Cook Inlet. Small craft advisories, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, east winds at 30 knots with 7 to 8 foot seas. No change in those two locations on Thursday, still winds east at 30 knots with 10 to 11 foot seas. Also, small craft advisories now for Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 25 knots. North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound winds out of the east at 20 knots with 3 foot seas. Kodiak Island, east to southeast winds for the day Wednesday, 20 to 25 knots. East at 30 knots for the Bristol Bay area. And for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds or south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And then for Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula, light variable winds at 10 knots with seas down to 2 to 5 feet. Light southwest winds at 10 for Bristol Bay. And for Kodiak Island, east winds in Shelikof Strait at 20 knots. And then here on the east side, northeast at 15. Eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 25 knots for Wednesday, west at 25 for Adak and Atka. And the western Aleutians, east to northeast winds there from Kiska to Shimia at 30 knots. And then for the eastern Aleutians on Thursday, low pressure here near Kiska Island. So winds blowing around that low center anywhere from 30 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, south at 30 knots. And the Fox Islands, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. For the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, winds will be east at 30 knots tomorrow, but only 15 knots out of the east for the Yukon Delta coast. Norton Sound, brisk wind advisories, northeast winds 25 knots. Northeast at 20 for St. Lawrence Island, and for St. Matthew Island and the Pribilofs, northeast winds 25 knots with 8 foot seas. And for Thursday, for St. Paul and St. George, winds now east to 20 knots, still 30 knot northeast winds for St. Matthew Island, and east to northeast winds at 15 for the southwest coast. Norton Sound, northeast winds 25 knots, northeast at 20 for St. Lawrence Island. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, northeast winds 25 to 35 knots, brisk wind advisory here for the western Arctic coast, northeast at 25 knots, and the central coast, north at 10. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Those become light and variable here for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast on Thursday at about 5 knots, northeast at 10 for the central coast, northeast 15 here for the western Arctic coast, and for the Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots.